Hey, how's it going, everyone? Don't know if anybody's out there yet, but that's all right. We're gonna get started anyways. Um, Looks like my preview's just a hair behind where I'm actually talking, so hopefully this is streaming all right. If there's anybody out there, hit me up on the chat real quick and let me know if you can hear me all right and if the video's coming through. Let me checking the feedback. So the monitor seems to be working. The audio's there. So let's get this going. Welcome to another episode of At the Bench. It's week 3, and this week we are going to be looking at links, figuring out how, or I'm going to show you how I do figure out what length of links I'm going to need, and how I go about making custom tailor fit links to specifically work with my application. Bogear RC, what's up, bro? Fist, pound it. Hey, thanks for checking in. Where are you from? What state, city, country? So the truck of choice you may have seen in the preview snippet, and it is this beautiful pink TF2. Well, what appears to be some TF2. It's a Mojave body, full-length bed still, and it may or may not be staying pink. This truck is actually going to be for my wife. So we'll go ahead. Clearly, you can see this truck's got a link length issue. The wheelbase that's currently on this chassis is not appropriate for this body. So we're going to address that, get the wheelbase sorted out, and figure out what length of links we're going to need to make this work. And by the time we're done, we'll be able to make it, fit more appropriate like this truck. And go ahead and pull it down. We'll have a nice full set of switch software. There we go. That one. We'll have a nice full set of tailor fit matched links that are DIY on a budget to actually get everything to fit exactly where I want it to fit. Now, if you're doing an out-of-the-box build or a kit build that uses a typical wheelbase, say you're doing an SCX 10.2 on a 12.3 wheelbase for a body that's got a 12.3 fender wells, then you don't need custom links. There's all kinds of link kits you can get out there for fairly inexpensive, and you can just throw them on there and it'll work. But if you're going to go to anything custom, then figuring out links can be a pain in the neck, especially to get the geometry to where it all works proper. One of the key things that a lot of people struggle with, which I'll touch on when we get to the front end of the pink truck, but is bump steer. Let's see if I can show it on here. So when the front goes up and down, you see that there's no steering reaction at all in those front wheels. And that's what you want. That means there's no bump steer going on in that chassis. And if you don't know what bump steer is, well, I'm going to show you on this truck, which has horrendous bump steer currently. So if you watch the front end when I go up and down, see those wheels turning back and forth? That's your bump steer. That means the front end link geometry is not good. Now, this has actually got pretty mild bump steer compared to what I've seen on some people's rigs. So this would actually, if you had stuff in the way that prevented you from making the link geometry better, this would be close to a tolerable amount of bump steer. But it can be a lot worse than that if your link geometry is wrong. So with that said, we'll go ahead. Bogear. Oh, you're down in Texas. Well, I get there a couple weeks, couple days. Oh, you're over in OKC. You're right over in my neck of the woods. I'm right up in Guthrie, probably about 30 minutes from you. So that's not too bad. The weather's actually okay. It's not too hot right now, so that's kind of nice. Scale jack stands, they're fantastic for displaying your rigs and keeping flat spots off your tires. But they're kind of a pain in the neck to put in position, so I'm just going to leave them not under that truck since we'll be grabbing it again here in a little bit. So let's get the body off of this one, maybe. There we go. Now, what's unique about this truck and also the other truck is both of these have my VFD conversion into a TF2 chassis. So there is no link kit that I can just buy off the shelf that will fix the geometry or set the wheelbase properly for this application. So I have to figure out my own links for these builds, and you know, it's actually not too bad. And once you have the right stuff to do the links, it's actually really cheap to do a full set of links. So it's a good piece of knowledge to have. So what we're looking at here, and because this truck's got the pink parts in it, it's really easy to see where some of the custom stuff is. But this has got we'll put it there, a custom skid under it that mounts the VFD and mounts it into the TF2 chassis. And we've got our link mounts that are in there. As you can see, the links in the rear of this chassis are excessively long. Originally, this was going to be a different body on here that was a longer wheelbase. Excuse me. And so now we're going to shorten it up and we're going to make the pink Toyota work on it. The other bits that we're going to look at is pinion angles. What's a good pinion angle? What's a bad pinion angle? And what you should be shooting for when setting up your link geometry to correct your pinion angle. Because depending on how you set your links, so if we look at it, let me switch it over here. At Fink Park. Bulgaria, I actually have not been to Fink Park. I've only lived in Guthrie now for a couple of months. I'm actually from the Pacific Northwest up in Oregon. Shout out to any of those guys up there if any of them are watching. So yeah, I haven't been to Fink Park. So you'll have to share that link. If you upload that to YouTube, share a link in my comments on this afterwards, and I'll look it up, check it out, and I'll have to get out to Fink Park and see, check it out for myself. Yeah, I wanted to get out, but I just did not have the time this weekend to get out and do any running. I got stuck working yesterday most of the day, and then, yard work. And then today I had to do some more work, those overtime hours pay for the hobby, right? So, but yeah, what I was saying about the links here is perfect 4-link geometry is almost impossible to achieve on any rig because there technically is no perfect. Different applications, different link geometry setups work better than others. And right now, as you can see, the lower links are significantly longer mounted up here than the upper links. That means that the uppers and the lowers are going to swing on a different radius, which is actually going to change the resulting pinion angle as the axle travels. So that's one of the things to look at. There are times where you want your pinion angle to actually change throughout the travel of the axle. And then there's times when you don't want it to change, and that all can be controlled by how you set your links up and where you mount them on the chassis. Now, if you don't have multiple options for where you mount them, a lot of comp chassis, you see those blocks right in this region on the chassis that have, half dozen or more mounting holes in them. That's so you can adjust that link length and get the link geometry just fine-tuned. Obviously, I don't have a whole lot of options here, but something that could be done to give more options is to use something like this tab that's back here for the shock, to use something similar to that bolted into the chassis to give me more link locations or a link riser position to give me more fine tuning in that forelink. But for now, we're going to go ahead and just use mounting locations that are on the chassis to get this sorted out, and then we'll have to do some testing and see what it needs and see if it needs to be adjusted more. So the first thing I'm going to do to make this a lot easier to work on is I'm actually going to pull the VFD out of here, and then the chassis will be a lot easier to manipulate and get to all the link screws, especially up here on the front end. That one. The VFD setup, whether it's in my custom application here, or even if it's in a stock application or an intended application by Vanquish, an SCX10 or even the VS410, is a super easy transmission setup to remove, and that is something that is great to work with. You just have the 3 screws right here in the top, which I'll leave that one for a second, and then you have one right here underneath, and you can just pull the whole transmission out and get it out of the way. So the scale motor setup that I've got on here that I did up for it is a 100% mounted to the transmission. It's not tied into the chassis up front. So once I pull this last screw, that whole assembly will be out of the way. Pull the servo wire out. Now, if there was a receiver, that I would have to open that up, but there's no receiver in there currently. It was just hiding the wire. So we'll go ahead and set that over here off to the side. And I'm also going to, we'll leave the servo there because we're going to need that. We'll just have to tolerate the servo wire bouncing around. All right, so now we got a much cleaner look at the geometry. So knowing that it needs to go a lot shorter, we're going to go ahead and pull. We're going to go to the rear first. That's not the right size. That's not the right size. There it is. Get the wheels out of the way. All right, man. Take it easy, Bull Gear. We'll see you later. Thanks for dropping in and saying hi. Enjoy that dinner. These wheels, if you are interested, they are an SSD wheel. I don't remember the model of it. It's like a, no, I'm not even going to guess because then I'll just probably sound dumb because it won't even be even close to right. The pink on the wheels come black with machined. Oh, this one does not want to pop off right now. There it goes. They come black with a can't talk. They're black wheel, and where the pink is usually just machined aluminum. Again, this being my wife's truck and being the pink fanatic that she is, she also painted those with a little bit of pink detailing for this truck. Actually, they were on a different truck. They were on the Bronco before she got her fancy pink Vanquish wheels. But, and yes, she has nicer wheels, technically nicer wheels on her trucks than I have on any of my trucks. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and pull the rear lowers. So something else I did in preparation for today's video is I played around with the audio stuff. I noticed when I was watching the video from last week, just listening through it and checking for issues with the cameras and whatnot, that the audio was not great. So I played around with some of the audio settings and how things were set up, and hopefully the audio is a lot better this week. If anybody wants to drop a comment somewhere and let me know, give me a heads up, that would be great. I think it's a lot better. From what I can tell on my end, it's a lot better than it has been the last couple of weeks. So that would be, hopefully, I'd hate for, it would be hard to watch these videos with terrible audio the whole time, having to listen to a bunch of nasty background noise. So this truck has, the other thing that's unique about this that makes it to where I need custom links set up beyond the fact that it's what you've already seen, is it has SSD axle housings on it. So they're AR44 based axles, and they have the SSD diamond housing conversion on them, which is super nice. It's got the front offset housing, which works great with the VFD setup in this chassis because it puts the drive shaft over a little bit to the what would that be? That'd be the driver side, so everything fits a little bit better. Knowing that these are too long and these ones are currently, there's no spacers or anything added, we're just going to get these out of the way, pull the rod ends off of them, and then we will dig into the link bin and we will start sorting out a much shorter link and see if we can get this rear axle squared up. So there's an event going on today that I was super jealous I didn't get to go to, up in southern Washington. They were doing a 100 gate course, and it sounded awesome. I just had one of my buddies that did go to that event. He just shared a bunch of photos, and it looks like it was a great freaking time. Which means they're probably not watching. Hopefully they'll watch it later. Otherwise, hey, maybe they won't, and I can talk smack. I'll have to look at the photos and see if I can find anything to point out to talk a little smack. All right, not really. So, one thing that is pretty nice about these SSD housing conversions for the AR44s is they're pretty inexpensive. If you already have an AR44 axle, SEX102 axles, that's kind of annoying. This one has to thread all the way out. The housing conversion uses all the internals from your AR44, and it comes with a new differential, and it comes with new axle tubes. You do need to use the link mounts from an AR44. So if you have they call it a one-piece axle where the link mounts are actually molded into the axle, you'll need to get a set of link mounts. But if you have the three-piece axle or whichever one it is, I'm not exactly an expert on exactly what the axle housings are called. But if you have the detachable link mounts, then you don't need to get new ones because those will bolt directly onto the SSD housings, which the SSD housings, the conversion kit for the AR44s, it's a nylon center pumpkin. So you get that plastic pumpkin that's still going to slide decently, but it comes with aluminum axle tubes. So the kit for doing the rear is, you can either get the rear specific kit, which has longer axle tubes and just end cups, and I think that it's like $27 to get that kit, and then you just use all your existing internals to reload it. The front, you can get a center diff kit the same way, and it's about the same price, and the only difference is it uses the same knuckles that are on your existing front axle instead of having a scaled out setup or a molded knuckle. I do think they have one that you can get that's a molded in knuckle, but it's also plastic tubes. I think it was something that was done for the Trail King, and it was I think it's comes with a Pro 44 diff and not a diamond. Either way, I don't recommend that one. I would get the one that's got the aluminum tubes and no knuckles molded in, because having the knuckles adjustable is a huge part of tuning your suspension geometry, because then you can optimize that caster angle on the front end, which can improve steering quite a bit. Alright, let's pull the front links. Not the front links, the front lowers. For that, I need my Allen wrenches. And junk. Definitely going to end up needing the 5.5 box wrench. If you don't have one of those, you should add that to your kit. It's a very valuable tool. That's not the right size. I really should organize these, but it's just easier to scoop them all up and throw them in the tin. There we go. So that's what I did. Right now, this bolt that I'm taking out of this link also holds this slider on, so we're going to need to swap that for a different bolt. The sliders that are on this chassis are the same sliders that are on the red and tan truck up here behind me. They're just a real basic slider that I whipped up a model for and 3D printed, because I wanted something that would fit nice and tight on the chassis. That's going to be too long. Those will be magnetic bolt bin. So these holes, I don't plan on using these for links. I don't remember why I chose those. It was probably because I didn't have another link option at the time when I originally had this set up for a different wheelbase that I used those holes, but I won't be using these mount positions for the upper rear links in this next setup. I have an idea of what's going to be needed on the rear, at least, from doing the other truck. It does have different axles in it. It doesn't have SSDs, but the link geometry should be pretty similar. So I'm going to start with the length that I put in that one and see how that works. Granted, I also think it has different rod ends, so that could play a factor in this too. We shall see. The rod ends that I'd like to use are the SSD rod ends. They work well for me. They're not the strongest rod ends out there, but I mean, they work well and the price is right. They're quite a bit less expensive, and they have most of the options for rod end style that I like, i.e. they've got a straight rod end that's got a long neck on it. Pop that one. There we go. Let's see if I've got the other styles sitting here. And that one's not an SSD, but it'll get the point across. There we go. Oh, there, I'm missing one. Where? So there's one that's got it. There's 4 general different types of rod ends you're going to find for these. You've got your, switch cameras so you can see this a little better. You've got your straight with a long neck. This is probably going to be your preferred rod end for most stuff. And just because you get a good thread engagement with your grub screw on there, and then you've got a straight with a short neck. There will be times where, for whatever reason, whatever links you have, wherever the geometry is, that you'll need one with a short neck. I try to avoid using those because the grub screw length of engagement in the rod end's a lot shorter, and it increases the potential of blowing a rod end out. So I usually try and stay away from using the shorts. And then you have your bent rod end, which I can get rid of those. You have a bent rod end, which you can see it's got probably about a 30-degree bend in it, maybe somewhere in that range. Those can be extremely useful when you have, especially if you have a little bit of a harsh link angle. It can be really useful for getting stuff lined up. And then the last one that you have, which there's one on this link, is you have your offset rod ends, which most of the time where you end up using those is on either steering linkage or pan hard bar, because you're trying to get the link to avoid something else on the chassis. So the length of the link, even on with bent rod ends, the technical length of the link is from eye to eye, but the link is offset out to the side, so you can still have the link length be perfect, but get the link itself moved over a little bit into a different position, which can be extremely helpful. So, and there's a good chance we'll run into a scenario where we're going to need that on this truck. All right, what was I doing? Oh, I need to put one screw back into the slider, and then we can start mocking up new links. So if you haven't seen it yet, I did start last week. I started a giveaway build, and it's still a ways out before it gets to the point that it's a finished truck, or and we get to the point on the channel where we're going to give it away, which is 1,000 subscribers on YouTube and 1,000 followers on Facebook. So we got to hit 1,000 on both, and then we'll do the giveaway on it. But I didn't get too far. If you watch that video, I didn't get very far at all, because I got to the point where it was time to install the links, and that just wasn't happening. The rod ends that were on it were terrible. The pivot balls were blown out and sloppy. And so basically, I called it quits there. Didn't even finish installing the axles to make it a rolling chassis. So that was kind of a bummer. I was hoping that was going to come together a little bit better out of the box from what I had. But that's okay, because I fully intended on changing a lot of that up. And one of the things it will get is a full custom link set that's built to match the body that's, the body that's going to go on it, which at this point is also undetermined. On the upside, it did give me an insight as to what was there, and so we ordered up some parts this week, and when those get in, we will do another round, or the first round of upgrades, with hopefully making it a rolling chassis with some nice upgrades on it. So we'll look forward to that in the coming weeks. That video is going to be, oh man, assuming that all goes well and the parts show up, which I don't have any reason not to believe they'll show up. That'll be in 2 weeks. That won't be next week's video. Next week I have a different plan, but that one will be in 2 weeks. All right, the rear end now needs links to go back on. I'm going to start with, on this truck up here, I had to use 85 mil links, 85 mil rods. They are 85 millimeters is what I used. Like I said, it had different rod ends, so this one might end up being a little bit different, because that does not have a matched set of SSD rod ends, and I don't have enough to do a match set on this yet, so there's a good chance I'll end up having to rebuild this link set when I do have all the rod ends in, but we're going to go with it anyways. Some of these are already the right ones, so we'll get it mostly correct anyway. Get rid of these long guys out of here. One thing I did add down in the description for anybody who's watching is I added links to all the parts that I prefer to use and some of the tools like these guys right here. I guess we need to make that camera a little bit closer. Not quite working in front of that camera. So we will do that real quick. Don't knock anything over. Hey, there we go. That's a little better. Now you can kind of see a little better what I'm working on. Spin this around. Okay. What I added, like I said, I added links to the tools I like to use and to the raw materials, because I do work with some raw materials with setting up the links. And don't be intimidated by raw material. It's not truly raw material. It's just lengths of aluminum tubing. I do aluminum links for my builds. I don't run any of these trucks hard enough to justify going up to some of the harder materials for links. And I also don't see the point in using brass links. If you're looking to add brass in your links, chasing that low CG, then it's time to actually reduce weight up higher and move weight down. Brass links, it just doesn't quite make sense to me. So for starters, we'll dig out those 85s, which I know I have some 85s in here that are already the right exact length, so I don't have to redneck some links together. The reason I know that is I actually ordered, before I was making my own, I had ordered links. Got these from RPP. They are Racing brand links, which I have 2 more here that have still never been opened. I don't think I put a link to these down in the description, but if you go to RPP and you look up Racing links, you can find that they have a bunch of pre-cut links that are tapped, and they're even anodized. Like you can see, these ones are anodized silver or gray, whichever color you want it, and they've got a nice little Racing logo on it with the length on there. I don't know, I think they were under $10 a pair, which isn't horrendous, but it is not cheap, especially if you consider just to do the main geometry links without getting into your steering at all or your panhard, just the 7 links in the back. You're buying 4 packs of whatever lengths to do that, and so if it was $10 a pack, that's $40 to do that. So the material that I like to use, which is here somewhere, was here somewhere. I think oh, there it is. So I ordered this material. There we go. This is 300 millimeter long aluminum tubing that has a 2.5 mil ID that you just have to tap. So I take this, I figure out what length I need, mark this out, and then I cut this down to length, and I get the exactly what I need, whether it's 85 or if it's 86 or 83.5. I think I had one on the truck up behind me that worked out to a 1/2 mil, and using my calipers and measuring it out and marking, I got the length cut to exactly the right length. A key component in that, which I'll show you that right now too before we start slamming links back in case you don't want to watch me actually chase links, but you want to know about the tools, is this little guy. Yeah, there you go. You can see that. This is a 2-inch benchtop cutoff saw or benchtop miter saw. I put a link to one of these down in the description on Amazon if you wanted to look at it there. I actually got this one at everyone's favorite store to hate, but we all still shop at, which is Harbor Freight. It was 45 bucks, 40 bucks, something like that at Harbor Freight, but it's Harbor Freight. Take it at your own risk. But it works great for cutting these links. You know, it has the little jig on the table here, which has a V-notch in it, so it holds the tubing perfectly. You can see it's got a little V-notch in there in the jig, right there, and it clamps the tubing perfect. And the table's got adjustable. For some reason you wanted to put an angle miter onto one of these tubes, or maybe you're building cage parts or something like that, and you needed to miter a tube to do some brazing with, then that would work too. It's on, you can go up to 45-degree angle on there, so that it's extremely useful. It made cutting these links a breeze to be able to pull this out, throw it on the bench. I do recommend, if you aren't going to bolt it to your bench, I do recommend clamping it in place. It makes it a lot easier to work with because it's not super heavy, and you could easily just shove it out of the way. But once you cut the tubing down to the length that you need, then you just take an M3 tap, which any M3 tap will do. You know, it's just a little guy. These are really cheap. I think the pair of them that I picked up, I think they were $8 on Amazon. I put a link to that below too if you want to just cheat straight to that. And then any tap handle, standard tap handle will work. I find them a little bit bulky and heavy for these tiny taps. So that I just whipped up a basic little palm handle that the tap just seats down into. That way I don't have this big heavy metal handle, and this worked great for just hand tapping the links. It didn't take very long, made the job quick and easy, and bam, custom links. The aluminum tubing, this guy here, 300 mils long, came in it's a 4-pack, which there's a link below for that too. It's a 4-pack of 300 mil long lengths, and that 4-pack, I think it was $14. So, and I think I ended up having to use 2.5 of those to do the link set for the other truck. Because of the way the links fell out, there was a little bit of fall off that wasn't long enough. Not quite 2.5. So there's still enough material that I can make a handful more links. I mean, as you can see, I still have one whole length plus the length in the saw to make more links with. So that's super useful. And actually, we're going to open these other 85s because I'm going to try and use them right now. But yeah, so a lot cheaper. I mean, $14 to make a whole link set versus buying, pairs at, $8 or $10 a pair. It makes, no sense, especially if you can't get the exact length that you need, because the pre-made ones only come in whatever lengths that they offer them in. So if they don't have the length you need, you've got to shim them to get that length just right, and that's just not ideal. So let's see here. We got one. Make sure I put matching rod ends together here. There should be 4 of those ones, and there's not. I lost one. Oh, there it is. Just couldn't see it. So for mock-up links, I never put any Loctite on them. When you actually are building your links to run them, I highly recommend a little bit of Loctite just to make sure that they stay nice and tight and it keeps everything together. They don't have to be super tight, but a little bit of Loctite helps. All right. The straight rod ends, I almost always try and use straight rod ends for the lower links, because the lower links see a lot of abuse, and anytime there's deviation in the link, whether there's a curve or something, that amplifies the amount of stress that's on there. If you want to know how or get into the science of why that amplifies the amount of stress in the link, find an engineering buddy and have him explain load transfer through angles to you. It's way more complicated than we're going to get into on this channel. I mean, I get it, I understand it, I know what it is, but I'm just not going to get into it because it doesn't really matter for these trucks. But because I have that type of brain, I am going to, I like to run my lowers with all straight rod ends if I can. The uppers, I usually end up running at least bent rod ends on one end so that it's a nice clean entrance at the top of the pumpkin. And then the other end, it really depends on how the link meets the chassis. Or the mounting point in which the link has. There's the other one. Nope, that's not it. Well, apparently I don't have... How do I not have another 85mm link? Oh, there. I do. It's here. I'm just being blind. So for now, since this had bent rod ends on both ends, and that's what I've got sitting in front of me, we're going to go ahead and install bent rod ends on both ends again. And we'll see how that looks. One of the things with rear link geometry that is not a bad idea to try and do is have all four links in the rear be the same length. That will make sure that the pivot angles of the arc swing between the uppers and lowers are all the same, which is going to improve how smooth the axle travels, and it'll also maintain the predefined pinion angle. When the arc lengths are all the same, the pinion angle remains constant relationship to the transfer case. So that's a little tidbit. It's not always possible. With a lot of chassis, it's not possible. But and then if you're having a link like this one, where the rod ends, that's not too bad. So there we go. With offset rod ends, 99% of the time, your offset or your bent rod ends will be bent in opposite directions. That also means if you have rod ends like these that have the flanged pivot ball on them, you can't even see that. That's terrible of me. See if I can hold it. You've got rod ends like, well, if you can't, you can kind of see. Okay, so that's got a nice small lip, and that's got a real wide lip. That's a flanged pivot ball. If you can, try and make that flange side of the pivot ball meet up against the surface that's going to have the most pressure on it. The metal screws, your head of your metal screw is pretty tough. So if you put the head onto the narrow side, that gives you a nice wide meaty surface. Nice wide meaty surface to go up against your chassis or your skid plate or whatever the compression surface is. If you're putting them, if they're going between 2 points, like these lowers do, they go between two flat surfaces. There's not a compression surface on the rod end. Then the flange side really doesn't matter, and you actually really don't need it because the pivot ball is not under compression, a thrust compression on the pivot ball, so it doesn't really need the flange. I don't really like dealing with the flange, so those are almost certainly going to be links that are getting replaced, or at least the rod ends are getting replaced, because I don't like the flange rod ends. Or pivot balls. They're more annoying than anything. Also, that means that they're semi-directional, in which case these ones are exactly the opposite at one end of what I need them to be. So we grab a pivot ball or our shock pliers, and we can pop that pivot ball out really easy. Get that out of there. Now I want it to meet the chassis that way. So we go, oh, sometimes they don't fit. Pivot balls only go in one way, not both ways. And I think that's one of the cases here, but since these are probably going to get tossed, we'll just, oh no, it went, no problem. The rear on the top of the pumpkin puts compression on both sides of the pivot ball, so I'm not going to worry about flipping that one. We're only going to flip the front, which is also going to need a spacer to work, and that geometry is not good. Okay, let me grab a screw and hold it in place, and I'll show you what I'm looking at. There's a good long one. So this is the hole I want to use right there. And we're going to put a spacer on there because it would be needed if we were keeping this pivot ball. It'd probably be needed with the straight one anyways because it's tight to the side. So if I put this in, and let's see, okay. The link angle I want, ideal link angle for these both being bent rod ends is, man, that angle is just not showing up with where I'm holding this. Let me move some stuff. All right, you can kind of see it. Hopefully I can explain it well enough. So the pivot ball rod ends, the ideal link angle here would be right there where it's at. That puts my rod ends to where they are going perpendicular to the length of the chassis, which is great. That means I'm going to have the maximum amount of travel in all directions of the rod end movement without binding. But in order for both of these bent rod ends on both ends for this link to work, it has to be somewhere in that region. So you can see that the rod end is actually pointing across the chassis. That's going to create an odd load into the side of the chassis, and it's not going to transfer well, and it's not going to travel well. It might bind. So we're going to get rid of one of those. Just remember, with your bent rod ends, I can probably show it better with both of these, is you want them to be, almost a perfect wishbone. Let me flip this one. So you want them to be, almost a perfect wishbone where the rod ends are parallel from one side of the chassis to the other. You see the mounting points with them being parallel, but that made my links at the top end or at the bottom end, they would have wanted to be, something like that to actually fit properly within the chassis rail. So that's not going to work. So we're going to ditch 2 of those for some straight rod ends, and let's see what I've got for straight rod ends. There's one. See if I can find a match. I really wish my my order of rod ends would have showed up before today. That would have really helped. That's got a screw. Oh, that's good in there. So we're working with a bunch of old stuff. All right, we're going to use 2 shorts because that's what I have. Again, I'll end up swapping these out for longs and readjusting the length to be correct for that. That's not what I wanted to do. I don't need to take that out. Typically what I like to do with the rod ends, that's got a bunch of junk on it. We'll spin it in here to get rid of it, is, first off, your grub screws are one end, like pretty much all grub screws, has the ability to put a driver in it. That end, you don't put it into your link like this with a tool. I'm only doing this because this has got some dried Loctite on the rod end, so I'm using dried Loctite on the grub screws. So I'm using the link to knock that junk off of there, so it's not all gunked up. But you use your Allen driver to put the rod end in, or the grub screw into the rod end, and then you put that into your link, because most of the time the grub screws are going to stay stuck into your plastic links or your plastic rod ends before they stick into your metal links. If they do stick into the metal link because of that dab of Loctite you put on there, then you just take 2 M3 nuts, spin it onto the rod end, and then cinch the 2 nuts together on the rod end, and then use the lower nut, and you can actually get the grub screw to back out of the rod end, or out of the link. If I run into that with one of the links that I'm messing with tonight, I'll show you exactly what I mean there. All right. There we go. We got one bent, one straight. This is typically how I would set it up for the rear. Sometimes I'll do that for the front too. For the upper links, is I'll do one bent link or one bent rod end and one straight rod end. And that's mainly for getting a nice angle coming off the top of the differential. There we go. There we go. Now let's put these guys in. That's going to give me a much better rod end angle going in. And this probably should have straights on both ends, to be honest. Or maybe these ones this one's less bent. Nope, bent the same. Okay. We're gonna install that and and see how it looks. So this one will go right there. So if you do custom links, what method do you use or what tools? How do you figure out your link lengths? What's your process? And obviously, if you're watching this video, you probably aren't somebody who's already doing custom links, because if you saw that's what I was doing and you already do your own custom links, you probably just bounced out thinking, I don't need to watch this guy. He's crazy and he's also being super slow. But you know what? It's kind of hard to go fast and do the videos. I mean, one, for those who need to see it, it can be you don't want to go too fast so they actually know what you're talking about and you're trying to explain. And two, it's actually challenging to try and work in front of a camera so that the camera can actually see what you're doing. I'm constantly having to look over at the video monitor and see what's there to see if I'm actually, working on the screen or working off the screen. But it's all good. It's kind of fun. I mean, I'm not going to say that I do this extremely fast anyways, even when I'm doing it not on video, because working on RCs is supposed to be relaxing. If you're not relaxing while you're doing it, then why are you doing it? Right? Right. No. Come on. another little tidbit, if you didn't know and you're just getting into links, is not all pivot balls are the same width. So you may find, which these ones are actually the pivot balls that are in these bent rod ends are a perfect fit for these SSD axles. So there's no shimming going on there, which is super nice because that's super annoying to do. But you may have to shim the pivot ball in the housing too, depending on what housing you have and what pivot ball you are working with. Once I get this screw in, oh man, I'm gonna have to get a power driver for this. Again, a lot of the axles I work on, at least on some of the other the other trucks I work on, the threading doesn't start until it gets to the end of where it's going here. And these SSDs, like most of the axial parts I worked on with the custom truck or the giveaway truck build, the threads are all the way through, which is good. It's going to make that screw really nice and sturdy, and the odds of it backing out really, really slim. But it's also a pain in the neck when you're trying to change stuff. So that's way too long of a bolt for that. Let's see. Throw in hardware. That's going to be the right length. So we're going to use that one. Which means I need another one that length. Magnetic hardware trays. I think I said this last week. Say it again. You need them. They're extremely useful. I highly recommend it. They're only a couple of bucks. You can get them at Harbor Freight. Well, I know you can get them on Amazon and a lot of other places. But I think Harbor Freight's the cheapest place I've seen them. I've even seen them for free at Harbor Freight with the sometimes when they do those coupons. And it's hard to pass up on one of those for free. Downside is if you don't stay on top of it, they end up collecting a lot of little hardware that never gets sorted back out and put away, and you start wondering, you know, it becomes overwhelming. So just watch out for that. One thing I didn't account for, or I mismeasured a little bit on my sliders, is these screws right here that I'm putting in. The heads of the screw just run right along the edge of the slider. So I may have to adjust that design just a little bit for that to clear a little bit better. But it functions. Let's get a couple of these out. And I am going to be doing massive amounts of mismatched hardware tonight. Just because I'm going to dig out of all the used bins, because this is going to go together and apart and together and apart. But when I do the final custom link install, it will be with fresh, clean, matched hardware, because that's the way it should be. I mean, why not? We're going to save a whole bunch of money on doing custom links. Might as well spend a little bit on some nice hardware, right? And by nice, I mean, you know, still ordering it from Amazon. It's just going to be new pieces that all match instead of ones that are worn and a little bit rusty. 5mm box wrench. Telling you, great tool. Gotta have one. Or 5.5mm box wrench. Mine's a Craftsman, which means I have a lifetime warranty on that. I fully expect Craftsman to honor that warranty. I'm not sure how I'm going to break it, but if I do, I expect them to honor it. Too bad Sears isn't around. take them the most random Craftsman stuff. You're like, hey, I found this at a yard sale. I mean, I bought this 20 years ago. It's broken. No, I've never done that. Fingers crossed. So I saw a link for an upcoming event. Well, upcoming is relative. An event in the future that I'm actually really excited for. It's sometime in October, and it's called, if I remember right, it's called Crawlapalooza, and it's in Disney, Oklahoma. If I understood correctly, it's an entire weekend of scale trucking. I mean, how does it get any better than that? Last year I was very bummed I didn't get out to any big trail truck events, which was a total bummer. But the year before, 2019, again, I was living up in Oregon at the time. I got out to Squirrel Fest, which is now the Jefferson State Jamboree. They moved locations and renamed the event, but it's still the same event. But that was an absolutely fantastic weekend long of camp out and RC. So I'm really excited to be able to go to another event that may be of the same caliber out here in Oklahoma. Fingers crossed. They did post the vehicle specs for different classes that they're going to have at the event. And it looked like it was mostly Sorca based, at least the building specs. I don't recall seeing the on course rules on there, but the build requirements or limitations for each class look like it was almost pulled word for word from the Sorca rules. It did mention a class 0, but there was no specs for what a class 0 was required. And they did add to it a little bit. Class 1 had a hard body requirement, so no Lexane in class 1, which I think is pretty cool. I think that all class 1 should be that way, just because I'm a big fan of, specifically with class 1 being really scale. Class 0's obviously the same way. Sorca doesn't have, the full Sorca doesn't have a class 0, so that's not something that's covered there. Sorca Light has a class 0, but I'm not sure on the actual specs for that. So I plan on building for that event. Obviously, this truck I'm working on right now needs to be done for that event. The Toyota, the red and tan Toyota, it's pretty much done. It needs some scale work done still, and needs the interior painted and the driver put in it and some other little things, but it's pretty much a finished build. I'm not even going to repaint that one. The two-tone body is, I like it too much for whatever reason. I'm a weirdo. Wrong way. The K5 body that you can see there, that build needs to be finished. That'll probably be a class 0. Well, not probably. It will be a class 0. You'll find out some more about that next week. Got some goodies coming for that. Something that I recently learned. We'll come back to the Disney thing. I want to point this out. Let me switch cameras. This is one of those things where I was talking about is the rod ends. So the pivot ball in this rod end, you can see it shifts back and forth in the mount, and that's no bueno. If you have pivot balls that shift back and forth, you don't want that. that's going to make your axle sloppy. It's going to lead to stuff moving or binding and not doing what it's supposed to. It's not always an easy fix. You can either get new rod ends or new pivot balls, either one, to fix that. In this case, and a lot of times what I do is, because the certain rod ends that I like how they function, is I don't change my rod end or the pivot ball. I shim the pivot ball in the housing. And what I do that using specific washers. And I know it's a little redneck, but it works. Is I use specific washers. The reason these are specific is there's a actual not a machine tolerance, but a thickness tolerance on these washers. So if I grab my calipers and I pinch this washer, and within the tolerance of what these calipers can do, sorry, it's going to be upside down for you, this is a 1/2 mil washer. So I can actually just come in here and I can measure, and that one's a little bit dirty because it's been used before. I can measure that this is a 7.5 mil spread on this mount. So it's meant for a 7.5 mil rod end, which that's probably what this one is. Yeah, so that rod end is right around 7.4, which means that pivot ball is going to fit in here with no slop, and it does. It fits with no slop. But you know, the other option would be, okay, we can try and swap the pivot ball, which isn't always doable, and I will show you why. Pop this guy out. So the other measurement on pivot balls, and the word balls is being said a lot in this thread. So is the actual diameter of the pivot ball itself, which in this case, this is a 5.8 diameter pivot ball. Now, if I pop one of these ones out that is too narrow for this mount, if it's the same, we will swap them. If it's not the same, we won't swap them. This one, if I measure the actual pivot ball itself, this one is 6 mil. 6 mil on the nose. So that's actually really close. We're going to try putting the smaller one, the flanged one, into this rod end, which it goes in, but now you can see that, I don't know if you can tell on that video angle, but you can see I can move the rod end back and forth on the pivot ball itself. This is going to blow apart. That's going to tear up the rod end. It's going to wear it out, and it's going to be sloppy. I might as well just left the other pivot ball in and not shimmed it. That's how much damage that's going to do. So you don't want that. If your pivot ball is sloppy in the rod end, that's going to cause issues. But you can get replacement pivot balls. You just have to make sure they're the right size for the application. Sometimes you can find the right ones. Other times you won't be able to find the right ones for your application, in which case you can shim them using those little washers. I probably did not put a link to those, but they're pretty cheap. You can get a bag of 50 of them, of the 1/2 mil thick M3 washers that are 6 mil OD, which the other thing that's nice about them is they're a nice small OD, so they'll actually fit. Just generic washers are a lot bigger in the diameter. So pick these both up. So you can see there's a very big difference in the diameter. So what you want is these guys right here, little 3 mil ID, 6 mil OD washers. They're really nice little shims for this specific application at a 1/2 mil thick. They're not machine shims like I showed last week for using on like the pinion gearing and stuff, where they're 0.1 millimeters thick or 0.2 millimeters thick. You could get those type of shims for this, but that would be a overkill pain in the neck to deal with. So let's see how many washers. I think it's going to need 2. Yeah. So that's a 6.5 wide, and the housing was a 7.5. So all I need is 2 of these little washers, which means I need 4 of them, and I'm actually really low. Those are a new. They do get lost really easy. I don't know how many times I've ordered batches of them, and they just seem to disappear even when I take them out of stuff. It might be because of their size and they get sucked up in a vacuum. You know, drop them on the carpet, gone. They disappear in the carpet really well. But I have enough for this spot. So they are kind of a pain in the neck to put in here. Since the lower links are coming towards the center, I will shim the. I'll put 1 shim on both sides. So a lot of times I'll look at the angle that my link comes off the connection point, and if I have to shim it, I'll shim it in the direction where it's most likely to avoid a binding scenario. So in this case, I wouldn't shim all the way to the center because I wouldn't want the rod end to bind, but it looks like it needs to be centered perfectly in that mount to be at a good angle. But sometimes you want to shim it off to one side if you have to shim it, so that it fits nicely. A tool, a handy dandy device for putting these in is super fine point tweezers. They make holding on to these and getting them down into the little spots they need to go into much easier. Doing that with your fingers is a pain. So 1's on, and now I need to get 1 more in there. This is the hard one. Come on. Like playing Operation when you were a kid. If you don't know what game that is, that makes me feel really old. And I'm not even that old. There we go. And it's... Come on. Left hand is not as coordinated as the right. So snug this up real quick. There we go. And now you can see I have no side-to-side movement in that mount at all, which that's exactly what you want. My rod end, it wasn't like I was forcing it in there. I didn't spread the aluminum at all because this has got aluminum shock mount or link mounts on it. So that's exactly how you want that to fit. And that was just a couple of little shims. So I mean, a lot of people get hung up on little stuff like that with stuff not fitting and not knowing how to solve that problem. And a couple, a little $3 baggie of 1/2 mil thick M3 washers with the 6 mil OD. Remember, that's the key part, the 6 mil OD, so that they fit in anywhere else that something like this is going in really easy. Can solve you a lot of problems for you. And I've even used them, and we probably will when we're working on the front, to actually shim my link to get the right length, because then I can add 1/2 millimeter at a time to fine tune the pinion angle, which if I hurry up and throw this link in here, I can show you exactly how I do that, because I'm almost certain that will have to tweak the pinion angle because, you know, nobody, and that's how they disappeared because I dropped it. No. Oh, it's all the way over here. Yeah, so I mean, that's how they disappear. I mean, if that would have went to the carpet, I wouldn't even have bothered trying to find it. Just not worth the effort. Unless, you know, you only have the exact amount that you need and you drop one and all of a sudden now you're on your hands and knees searching around on the carpet trying to find your washer so that you can shim your pivot ball. Oh man, this is so the language being used today, I apologize. And to think I'm not even drinking a beer today. It's just a Coke. Get in there. There it is. And that one's in. All right. Same thing, no play. Nice, that's a good fit. All right, now let's bring these guys up. I do only have the VFD skid that I designed does only have one mounting position for the lower links. Upper links are more flexible depending on what else you add to the chassis, but the lowers, there's only one spot to mount them. So we have to go with that and adjust accordingly. Some of the comp driven stuff does have more options for mounting even on the lowers, but this isn't really a comp truck. The red Toyota, it does alright. I mean, it does really good for what it is, but it's not, you know, a V1, C1, or, you know, equivalent competition chassis. I don't know what they all are because I don't have any of them, although I wouldn't mind building one, so that's probably something you're going to see in the future. That needs a little bit of 3D prints can be a pain sometimes. Not everything is a perfect tolerance fit. So I will just give that a quick file. Make sure there's no burrs on the printed part. Now that should go in there a little bit easier. It's one of those things with printed stuff, you can design the tolerance perfectly in software, but 3D printers, at least the homegrown hobby grade printers, tolerance is not the best. I mean, they're not terrible. You can definitely make good functional parts, but you will have to do a little bit of finish sanding, or in this case, filing to get things to be just right. Because I mean, if these holes were oversized, then I have to deal with shimming. If they're just slightly under, then a quick file fixes that. Just take the edge off it. Probably should have tapered those edges going in. It would have made it easier to put the slide, get the pivot ball to slide into place. But again, this is the a TF2 chassis with a skid that I designed in order to mount a VFD, and I'm sorting out links for the SSD diamond converted AR44s. All right, that's in far enough for us to see what's going on. All right, so I can tell right now that the pinion angle is a disaster. It's pointed to the moon. In order to find out where the wheelbase is at, we need to throw the wheels back on and set the body on, and then we can see where the wheelbase is at. We'll see how close we are, and once we know how close we are on the wheelbase, I'll know whether or not we shorten the upper links or lengthen the lower links to correct the pinion angle. Obviously, with the way the link mounts are on this axle, the upper and lower links cannot be the same length, and use the current mounting points on the chassis. And unless I make some new parts, I can't correct that by moving mounting points on the chassis. So if you had a chassis with different mounting points, you could move the chassis mounting points instead of changing the link length to correct the pinion angle. So you can see what the pinion angle looks like easier. My driver is down on the drive shaft. So you can see that the pinion angle and my drive shaft joint is more or less, is straight to the eye. Means the pinion angle should be coming off the drive shaft, should be horizontal, like this driver I'm holding here. That way, so that it's parallel to the output shaft on the transfer case. That's proper, technically proper geometry for drive shafts. There are exceptions for that. Again, that comes down to application and I don't remember why I had these two nuts here. There are applications where you do want a raised pinion angle, where you can run a raised pinion angle, but most of the time it's not ideal. And it can cause excessive wear on drive shafts, especially if you have a drive shaft that uses a universal joint and not a CVD joint. The drive shaft that's on the back of this currently is a CVD style, so it's not as susceptible to phasing or pinion angle equal opposites is what the term for it's called, is having the pinion angle at equal and opposite so that they're perpendicular, or not perpendicular, parallel, the output and the input. So other than the shocks being terrible at the current position, the wheelbase has been corrected, and that is almost perfectly aligned in the wheel well. So let's see, what does that wheelbase measure out? That wheelbase measures at, it's right about 11 3/8. We'll go to the metric world. In 290 millimeter is what I'm measuring on the wheelbase. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly what the wheelbase is for a regular TF2. Oh, those shocks are just not in a good spot. I'm gonna pop those loose real quick. Let's see if I can get this to sit down right, because when it does sit lower, it is going to stretch the wheelbase, because the links will move on the arc of their mounts, so it will move the rear axle rearward when it sits lower. So we need to and it's not going any lower with those shocks, or not with those mounts that are on there right now anyway. So how let's just disconnect them. We'll just disconnect them. We'll let it sit all the way down. Because this is actually going to run fairly low. One, I think they look better. Two, they almost always handle better when you get them down a little lower. And, you know, now, typically with the TF2, the shocks on stock axles, for a TF2 will mount, the bottom of the shock shaft mounts this way into the housing, and they're pivoted at an angle like this, and they'll mount on this crossbar right here. Obviously with these housings, that's not going to work. There's just no way to actually mount the shock so that that'll work. So I'm going to have to go to some sort of side mounted shock on this. I may explore the cantilever setup for this chassis, or I may just make some parts that match what I did on the other truck up on the shelf, which solves this problem altogether. And it mounts the shocks in a similar position as they're in right now. They're just a little bit further forward, and it works a whole lot better. So, all right, there we go. So now that's a good sign. Other than correcting the pinion angle, the chassis drops all the way down to the axle with no binding. Oh no, there is a touch of binding right. Is it binding or is it just the axle? I think it's just the axle moving that I'm feeling. Okay, so I'm happy with that as far as link movement. The fact that the chassis can drop all the way down to the axle is means that I've got all the clearance I'm going to need on my links to set this up however I want at any ride height, to include being, you know, all the way down. Now, will it ever be all the way down? With the shocks set up correctly, if I get the shocks set up correctly, it actually might be able to get all the way down and make use of that travel. Now, the ride height won't be there. The ride height will be, you know, in that region right there, which means it'll have up travel in the chassis. I think it might just be a stiff pivot ball. Ah, that's what I'm feeling. Okay, so it is binding a little bit. It's the pivot balls on top of the pumpkin are binding with the top of the pumpkin, which we're going to fix that once we fix the pinion angle. So that's what's next on here, is fixing the pinion angle. Let's take a look at the wheelbase real quick with it being able to actually go down. We're just going to slip that in like that. Downside to no shocks, the rear end can actually fall out the bottom too. So that's probably the ride height I'm going to go for on the back, and I'm still happy with the wheelbase. So being happy with the wheelbase means that we need to move, not just extend or shorten upper or lower. We actually have to change both upper and lower to keep the axle in the same position and rotate it in place. So to do that and bring the pinion angle down, I need to make the lower links longer and make the upper links shorter. By doing that, when I make the upper link shorter, it'll pull the top of the pumpkin forward, which will shorten the wheelbase a little bit. Oh no, it won't. I only need to shorten the top. If I shorten the upper links, it will it'll rotate the axle about the lower links. It might shorten it a little bit, and I might have to shim the lowers, but I think I can get most of this out just with a adjustment to the upper links. So let's pull those out, and we're going to shorten them, which means since I don't have any shims on those, I will actually have to change out the link, the actual rod itself for a shorter one, and I may have to shim it. We're going to start by taking 3 mils out, and that's a pain in the neck. So we'll disconnect these first. No, I don't want to disconnect those. They're a pain in the neck to put in. We'll do it on this side. The link process is kind of annoying. I think tonight we might only do the rear. See how long it gets, how much longer it takes to get the rear in place. And we might leave the front well, maybe next week. I don't have a full deal for next week. That way you don't get too burnt out on links. This is also why when I'm figuring out links, I don't put Loctite on them, because I'll probably end up having to take them off a couple of times. So that one, that looks like it's about 5 or 6 mils shorter. Does it have a length on it? Sometimes you'll find links, which this is one of the nice things about links that are purchased. I don't remember where this one came from, or if you can even see it on there. You can kind of see it. No, I don't think you can see it on there. But this one says 75 on it. So going from an 85 down to a 75 is going to be too much of a change. It doesn't need 10 mils off of it. So for that, I will grab some spacers. One spacer. How long are these spacers? But I'm gonna put an 80 on the top and see where that puts it. That's way too long. That's a 12 mil. I need to organize my spacers. That's a match though. I will just steal one off this shock that we're not mounted up with right now. That's another nice thing you can do with that aluminum tubing, is you can make spacers as needed. You've probably noticed that I have spacers on the shock mounts currently that are pivot balls that aren't being used for anything. So those will get replaced with spacers that are made to the correct width once I get the final suspension geometry sorted out. Because the shock position, the spacer that's going to be needed there is going to be very dependent on getting the forelink dialed in, and then which shock and where it's mounted on the chassis will determine how far off the mount it needs to be there. And it may actually not need a mount at all, because I recently figured out a way to put a sway bar onto the TF2 chassis that I'm pretty happy with. I need to test it out on some terrain some more, but as far as the behavior of the suspension with a sway bar on it, I actually really like. So that will be something that we may see in the near future on this, as well as the install of a sway bar onto one of these rigs. And which sway bar, because I didn't have to actually modify the chassis at all, and I didn't have to modify the axle, didn't have to modify the chassis. I changed out one piece of hardware, well, one pair of screws for something different. So it was a nice, easy install. And sway bars, especially if you have a heavier rig, a sway bar can be super helpful to keep it a little bit more stable. But there's not a whole lot of options for sway bars. The Vanquish has one. It's really nice. I don't have one of those. It's as nice as it is, it's also a bit pricey. So figuring out how to do something new with a fairly expensive part is not always ideal. So I went with something a little bit cheaper. By a little bit, I mean quite a bit. Someone who's creative could probably, with a little bit of ingenuity, could probably build one themselves. If they knew what they were building, they could probably build a sway bar from scratch. So that's always an option. It's not, sway bars aren't all that complicated once you grasp how they are intended to function. Anyway, I think that I'll stop talking about sway bars because that's for a different video. Get rid of that one. So the other thing I'm doing when I'm changing these out is I'm changing the grub screw for a longer grub screw so that I have enough meat on it to put this together with the spacer. Typically when I build my custom links, I use 20mm grub screws so that I have a significant amount of engagement between both the rod end and in the aluminum link. That'll, you know, the steel of the grub screw does help strengthen up that joint, and the longer it is, the better load transfer you get between the rod end and the link itself. That was it, right? 75. Yeah. If you only have, 3 or 4 turns of grub screw into the link, it significantly increases your chance of blowing out the link, and that's never fun, especially if you're out on the trail and you break something that you can't fix on the trail. Then that kind of ruins the day. Slam that back in. Oh, I can't see it. There it is. Stay. So as great as the little box wrench is for working with these, it's not ideal for putting them back on because it doesn't hold on to them. problem I'm having right now is the space I need to install it is consumed by the link. There we go. Now I can actually get the tools in where they need to be. So I can put this in. Actually, that's enough room. I don't even need the needle nose now. Yeah, if you don't have a couple little sets of small needle nose, that's another tool I'd highly recommend for working on RCs. The bent needle nose come in really handy. The straight needle nose come in really handy. So again, you don't need fancy expensive ones. Just generic. They aren't doing any. If you're doing any really ripping hard on anything with needle nose pliers on your RC, then you're probably doing something wrong, or whatever you're doing, you're not using the appropriate tool for the job. So needle nose pliers aren't meant for really cranking on stuff. They're meant for getting to things that are hard to get to. Can't say I haven't used needle nose pliers to crank on stuff, but it usually ends up tearing them up. All right, I think that change actually will fix the pinion angle quite well from the looks of it. So before, when I let go of the chassis when it was up, it just kind of sat and had a little bit of a hanging point. Now it drops. That is completely free of binding, and that was these upper rod ends binding on the housing a little bit, creating a little bit of pressure on the link. Now that's a 75 mil upper link with a 5 mil spacer added to it for a total of 80 millimeter long link rods, not including the rod ends. So I'll have to measure out rod end to rod end in order to figure out the proper link, and that won't happen until I get the correct rod ends that I actually want to run on this, which are those SSD Rod Ends that are still in transit. But now I have a template to go off of for setting those up. I can take it off, match it up, and then it'll be done. The other thing that is now corrected, like I was saying, is that pinion angle. So you can see that now my pinion angle, if I can even put the driver on it now, which I don't know that I can, and get it straight. No, I can't even get it quite straight with the driver on it because it's just below the chassis plate. So the first time, it looks like I'm gonna have to take that wheel off to show you pinion angle. So before we do pinion angle, we'll set the body on and check wheelbase. See how much, if any, the wheelbase changed with the link correction. That side's on. All right, we'll switch cameras. All right, so at full squat, the wheels are right at the back of the fender well, which I'm perfectly happy with that being right at the back of the fender well. And when I come up a little bit to ride height, that is well within the Sorca limit of alignment. And I like the wheel to run a little bit to the rear in the wheel well anyways. I don't know why. That's how my other truck is set up too. That's the way I set them up, and that's how we're gonna go with it. And I'm actually, that link combination is really good. So now let's the last thing to show you on that is the pinion angle. I can't pop the body off when I can't see the other side. The body on this one goes on the same way it does on all the other Toyotas I do. I just put the body mount post, have a little grub screw hanging out, 1/8 of an inch, and it just snaps into the holes on the body, and that's it. Super easy for that toolless removal. All right, I'll pop the wheel off so you can see the pinion angle. I'll do this side with the right driver. Nut driver set is super handy. Another great tool to add to your RC collection. This specific set was like 13 or 14 bucks. It was quite cheap. For the nut drivers, they don't need to be, you don't need anything super fancy. I mean, MIP has a set that's probably really nice. I don't have them. I know Vanquish makes some, and some of the other brands make some really nice ones. And I have no doubt that they're really nice tools, but there's not a huge benefit to having them. If you're using the tools appropriately, the cheap ones work fine. You just don't get that bragging rights on brand is all. Unlike the hex drivers, I do highly recommend good quality hex drivers. They do make a difference in actually working on your truck and whether or not you strip hex heads out or not on stuff. All right, so now that that's out of the way, you can see, let's switch to this one. So you can see see if I can get this positioned in a good spot. That way. Oh, there we go. That's pretty good. So you can see my pinion angle is almost parallel. I'm holding the drive shaft, but the pinion, which is this part of the housing right here, this is my pinion part of the housing, is almost parallel to my chassis rail and my skid. And realistically, man, holding this in a position that's easy to see is kind of tough, and keeping everything squarish. Realistically, it could be fine-tuned just a hair, but I'm actually pretty happy with where that's at. Once the drive shaft is in and up, you can see that the pinion itself is slightly above the lower links, so that's going to help reduce hang-ups on the pinion itself. When I put scale drive shafts in, because I'll be switching this over to universal joint drive shafts, I like the SSD universal drive shafts. I think they work great and they hold up well and they look good. So when I switch to those, I'll be able to have good, ideal, equal opposite angles for my drive shaft, so that the U-joints can be phased properly and I don't get any weird oscillations or have bad wear on the U-joints from improperly phased drive shafts and bad pinion angle. Pinion angle can also affect load into the chassis and into the transmission. It can cause issues there with bearings. I'm not sure that that's really an issue in RCs so much, especially in the crawlers that are mainly slower trail trucks, just because they are fairly lightweight and they don't see the road miles that a real car sees. In real cars, it's really critical to have pinion angles set up right, because it can cause major damage and accidents when a pinion or drive shaft or bearings blow out due to improper pinion angle. So the rear is good. I really wish I had a better shock position so that we didn't have to put it sky high in the air. But I don't have a better solution for that right at the moment, I don't think. So I wonder, let me grab something real quick. Grabbing a part out of another box. Just out of curiosity, something I've never tried. But if they're consistent with how they make stuff and how they space stuff, this might work. Nope, it doesn't. It doesn't line up. So they didn't space it the way I thought they might. That would have been a creative thing to do. What I was checking is these are just a set of TF2 shock hoops, and there's a set of holes back here on the back of the chassis. I was curious if they were spaced the same as they are on the front of the chassis, and they're not. That's okay. Man, it really needs to sit on the shocks. It's driving me nuts. All right, we're just gonna have to put it skyjacker style. Actually, no, we'll just leave it. It's fine. Front end. I guess we can look at the front end now, which means I need to take the front wheels off. Not that one. This one. Oh, the group chat is blowing up. That's the my buddies from up in the Northwest. I wonder. Let's see. It's almost 8 o'clock here, so we're almost done. We obviously won't get the front end done today, but that means it's 6 o'clock there, so they're probably, you know, getting home from a day of good times out RCing. I'm looking forward to seeing all the photos and hopefully some video of their outing. All right, so front geometry. The most important thing with front geometry is going to be found in the, not that camera view, there we go. It's going to be found in the panhard and steering angles. This is where you're going to find all your bump steer issues and your axle side to side play issues. Almost all of that comes from the steering link or the panhard and the steering link. So if those two, the ideal setup for panhard and steering link is equal length and parallel. So as you can see with this one, it is far from being the same length and from being parallel. These were thrown on here to hold things in place, but obviously I have not sorted that out yet. I'm going to need to figure out a panhard mount, because this is just something I had kicking around, which is not even well mounted. It can rotate in place, which is not ideal. So that's an issue that's going to keep things from going forward on setting up the front geometry. So we're not going to get into actually figuring out the link lengths until I can figure out that geometry for the front end. But that's one of the key component there is equal length steering and panhard, and the steering and panhard to be parallel. If you can get those equal and parallel, your front geometry that's 90% of the battle. Then the three links, the other three links, it's the same thing we just did on the back. Figure out what puts the axle in the right position forward and backwards so that the wheelbase is correct, and what sets the pinion and what corrects the pinion angle so that your pinion is pointing in the right direction. Again, the same rule applies for pinion angle in the front as it does in the back. Is your pinion should be parallel to your chassis rails or slightly up pointing towards the transfer case. You never want your pinion angle pointing down at all. So if a pinion angle is pointing down, then you're going to have problems with your drive shaft binding. You're going to get oscillated rolling speed. So if you give it just a little bit of throttle and your truck's oscillating in how fast it's going, that could be a problem with drive shaft phasing or pinion angle causing that. Excuse me. So that's something you definitely want to take into consideration when you're setting up links. Even some of the out-of-the-box RTR trucks, the link angles aren't great. And just a little bit of playing with correcting pinion angle and correcting some of the geometry can make a huge difference. So I mean, I don't think I'll bore you with this anymore tonight. It's been, an hour and a half or something, and all I've done is figure out the links for the rear of this build. And because I don't have a panhard setup figured out for this, and I'm almost certain that the servo setup that where it's at can't work, and I don't have know what the steering link's going to be on this yet. There's no reason to really get into the front end of this as much as I want to. Actually, one thing I will show you, messing with my other truck, I did figure out a new way to mount the steering servo in a TF2 that I haven't seen done before. Not saying somebody else hasn't done it, but it's what fixed my steering issue on the other truck in order to get that equal and parallel link set up working. That one, so we'll go ahead, we'll move this one, and who knows, maybe it'll get us somewhere closer to where the geometry needs to be on the front of this. Come on. I think I need to add a pit mat or something to this table so that when I set tools down, they don't make nearly as much noise, and so stuff doesn't roll around as much. That'd be a nice thing to do. Maybe I should do that sooner than later. Maybe the next trip, maybe I can send the wife to like Joann's or something. Maybe she can find something that would be a good suitable filming color for the top of this table. Okay, so the steering link's disconnected from the servo, and we'll disconnect the servo from the mount. So the reason that I didn't figure this out before is, well, because I never had to. If you're running a standard TF2 drivetrain, there's like 3 different ways you can mount the servo into the chassis to make it work right for whichever drivetrain it is. And the geometry works good with the stock axles. Or if you're on leaf springs, it works great for being on leaf springs. I mean, there's not much that needs to be changed. But as soon as you start going to custom setups, figuring out the right spot for the servo can make a huge difference for how you get that front geometry set up. It comes back to that whole equal and parallel thing. If the servo is not in the right spot, then you'll never be able to get the steering link as long as it needs to be equal and parallel with the panhard. But what you can do, come on, pop out of there. There we go. I'll turn this around. Switch over here. So typically this mount is in the chassis on a TF2 like that. That's the typical install for a TF2 servo mount. And depending on which drivetrain you're running, the servo sits here in the front, going across the chassis. and it's typically with the head of the servo this direction, with the steering link going, stay there, with the steering link going from here down to that corner is your typical TF2 with an R4 scale trans in it. That's how it's going to be. And then if it's got an R3 transmission with the motor up here, which is what's typically in your Marlins or your Mojave TF2s, the servo sits here and the link goes the same direction from this corner here of the servo. The servo horn would be going towards the rear typically, but the link would be going from here over to the knuckle on the driver's side. But that wasn't working for the setup I was after in the other truck, partially because it's running the VFD setup I've got in here, and it wasn't, and it's not stock axles. So what I did is I took this mount, the servo mount, and I clocked it 90 degrees, and I reinstalled it like this, which on this chassis it actually needs to go the other way because of where the panhard. So on the SSD axles, the panhard goes from driver to passenger knuckle. On a on the other truck, the axles that are on it, my Max Pro axles, the panhard goes from passenger to driver side knuckle. So the panhard goes the opposite way, so the servo's installed, the mount's installed the other way, which this will create a little bit different offset in the servo by turning it because the tabs aren't centered on the bar here, but it'll go in. Come on, hop in there. It'll go in like that. Bolt it in. Now it does require a spacer to get things correct, and to really optimize the fit you have to run a low profile servo, but you know, that's not that big of a deal. There's some nice low profile servos out there that have good torque numbers and are IP67, which is basically your waterproof rating, as much so as any other servo marketed for RC crawlers anyway. So with that in like that, then my servo, which will have the horn going the wrong way. This servo is one I probably need to, will be replacing. It's a high-tech servo that is underrated in torque for the application. I think it's only like a 12 or 13 kilogram torque servo. So it's a placeholder, as is this servo horn. It'll get a 20 mil servo horn. So now if I put this in this way, man, I wish the servo was a different color so it was easier to see. But if I put it in this way, then I have a problem with the servo being too far forward, and this is what I was talking about. It'll end up with some spacers to bring the servo body towards the rear a little bit, which I think I have a spacer I can put in there. Yeah, this one will mock it up. We will mock one in there real quick just to hold things in place. I can find an appropriate screw. Again, here's this spacer right here. This is cut from that aluminum tubing from the neck size up, because that tubing and the link that I attached below has all types of, or a whole bunch of different sizes. So you can get tubing in the various diameters to include a 3 mil ID, which makes great spacers. and then you can actually create your own low buck spacer solutions that are exactly the length you need. And it's better than, they'll definitely hold up better than say a 3D printed spacer would. It'll look nicer, and it's still cheap. So, yep, and that'll bolt in just like that. So now, obviously it's not perfectly squared because there's only one bolt in it. The servo is behind the end of the frame rails. It's above the frame rail, so you can still put your front bumper in if you're using the frame rail mounted bumper. So that all still fits, and that'll work with that should work with an R3 or R4 transmission, which I have both. Let me check. I don't have either set up in a way that I could just drop it into this chassis. Because of the other stuff that's already in this chassis, both of those I can't actually put them in the right spot to really show it. I mean, neither of them have motors on them either. So that's something I'll have to test. Or if you have a TF2 that's set up this way, or set up with an R3 or an R4, you can just try turning your servo mount. And by putting it in there a different direction, you might be able to improve that panhard geometry if you're running a linked TF2, or actually I think a Galant uses this same mount, so that might be an option on the Galant as well. But again, servo geometry for that steering angle it's a significant deal. So that's something to look at. I don't know that that's the permanent solution for this chassis, if that'll work. I know it works great on the other one, which we'll take a quick look at now, because I think we're done with this one for now. And I can show you my finished link setup. So this truck has got basically using the same process of figuring out lengths, figuring out pinion angles, and then, and figuring out that steering geometry like I showed you at the very beginning to eliminate bump steer. This has got a finished set of links in it, and it's also got a servo, the steering servo mounted the way I was just showing you. So you can see the servo bodies here, the aluminum horn of the servo is right there, and it drops the steering link, right down underneath. So that geometry works really well. This is a stubby servo. As you can see, it's a 19 kg servo that I'm running on this one. And surprisingly, it actually works really well for being a 19 kV servo. Or a kg servo, it works great. This is the one that's also got the back here in the back. It's got the sway bar set up on it. That needs a little bit more testing. Yeah, and then there's a finished set of links cut from the tubing. You can see it's got straight rod ends. I've got straight rod ends back here. Back here, my pinion angle is ever so slightly pointed up. It's got the universal style drive shafts. The rear is an SSD. The front is I don't know. It's really old. The front needs to be replaced. That's what it needs. But they're both universal style, which is key in having good drive shaft angles, or good pinion to transfer case equal and opposites to keep those joints, and to make sure that phasing works out. But yeah, so that's our end goal, is to have a set of links like this. I will plan on getting the link geometry for that truck and the front end figured out as far as a panhard mount and steering links to optimize it. I don't know that I can get the SSD housing to even up as nice as I did this truck. But I'll see what I can do to make that work and have links ready, and we'll install links on that truck. Hopefully next week we can install some links on there, do something that's actually a little bit more fun and make a closer strive to having something that's more finished and not just taking stuff apart and finding out I can't finish it ideally. Next week I will also pull the K5 out. There's some really trick thing that I figured out. It's probably not new. It's probably been out there. The information is probably available. But a trick thing that I figured out with a setup with an axle that's on there, that if you don't know, you're gonna want to know. So we'll do that next week for sure. That is an absolute, that deal with that axle, that'll be a must. And then we'll, if that goes quickly, yeah, right. Then we'll play with the pink truck's front links a little bit, or something along those lines. Anyhow, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any suggestions or questions about doing links or any of the tools I use or the materials, where I got it, what it is, like I said, I did put links to stuff in the description of this video down below. Be sure to check those out. If something's not down there that you do want to know about, just hit me up, put a message in the comments once this is over, because I don't know that, oh no, the live chat's still there. Either way, just let me know, hit me up on here or on Facebook. Hit that like button, subscribe if you want to get, and hit the bell. I think you have to hit the bell to get notified. Maybe you don't, I don't know. I don't follow it that close. But if you want to keep up with what comes next on these builds and future builds, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Help us out. Get it to the, let's get to the 1,000 followers so that we can, because I want to do the giveaway. I really want to do it. I just need to finish it. Yeah, 2 weeks. 2 weeks is the next video on the giveaway truck. I'm actually kind of excited for that. Oh, look. All right, look what I just noticed. Maybe I'll fix that right now. There's a spacer missing. You can't really tell. Oh, good. So if I wouldn't have pointed it out, no one probably would have noticed. But there's a spacer missing right there. I either only put 3 in or I lost one. I think I only put 3 in. Anyhow, yeah, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you on the next one. Have fun with RC. Yeah.